Hello, and welcome to demo number 7, which really should be demo number 8. I think somewhere along the way our numbering's got a little bit messed up, but this is going to be a demo on tests in Node.js. Now, here I want to give you a very quick example of how we do a unit test in Node.js, which is probably the most common type of test that you're going to write. And unless you're creating several subsystems in your projects, you're probably, for the majority of your project, you're going to be writing a lot of unit tests. So unit test is really testing one facet of the functionality in your application. So as we said in class, our goal is to write enough tests that we're convinced that the feature that we've written is correct and is functioning properly. And as long as we keep running these tests and these tests keep passing, then we're convinced that this feature is still here and still working and it hasn't broken the build. So one of the things that we also mentioned is that it's really not possible. There's no heuristic to measure completeness of a test. All we can do is say, okay, I'm going to write these tests, and if these tests all pass, then I should be convinced that this test that corresponds to this feature or this story is good. It's describing this story properly. So let's do that. We have our application that we wrote from the last few demos here. I'm not going to get into kind of modularizing our code, although you can understand that the purpose of all of this is eventually we want to modularize all of this code. You can probably imagine that it's not good programming practice just to have an app.get, 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 app.post, and all of these things. So perhaps later on in the semester, once we get really going on our projects, we'll talk about how we can kind of modularize our code. How do we split it into different files for different purposes? You'll probably pick this up as you go through your projects as well. But what we want to do here is I want to add the functionality of the add user. So the purpose of this add user is I have a post request. Now remember, post request is I'm sending some information along with some form that presumably some user has filled out. So when they send this form that has the uname, the variable uname, the name uname, and the name age, both of these are sent to this server, and the server listens for this request and is going to grab from the body the variable uname as well as age. I'm just going to put them into a variable. And in an earlier demo, what we did was we just sent the reply as something like this, right? The uname is equal to this variable and the age is equal to that variable, which, there's probably more that we can do with this, but it seems like the purpose of this route, add user, is to add this person to the database. Now, also, we've created a database earlier, and I just want to very quickly verify that database. PSQL, I'm still using the user Postgres, although I would highly recommend that you use a different user in your projects. So localhost. I use root as my password, and I'm going to change over to this database called users, I believe it was. All right, so now I'm in this database called users. I'm very quickly going to check the tables, and there was a user. All right, there was a database called users. So I'm going to select, table called users. I'm going to select star from user. And just to verify that I have those people there. And in fact, one thing if I'm working with a table is just to give a description of what it is. So I have a UID, a user ID. I have a first name and an age. So basically, I think what I'm imagining, a functionality where the person sending in their name and their age, I'm going to put it into the database. Okay. Now, I am local here. This is I'm working with my local database, and there are ways that I can change the UID to update every time we have a new user. Okay. So I'm not going to do that here, although when you create a table, if you want an integer or something to kind of increment every single time with every new user, then I'm basically doing create table. Let's do user again, and our UID, instead of integer or character, we use the word serial. So serial basically means that I'm not really going to supply the UID. Well, I don't have to supply the UID. If I don't, then it's going to find the next available character or next available number, and it's going to assign that. So it's going to start at 1. So the very first person that I insert into this table without a UID, they're going to pick the number 1, then the number 2, and then number 3, and so on. Okay, so this just gives me a way to be able to put something into the table without specifically having to increment a UID or like finding the next available integer by myself. So if you've taken a course like database, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because in database, we have this thing called primary key, which basically says that there's always this attribute that's going to uniquely identify a table, right? So our UID here is presumably the one that's going to uniquely identify the user ID. It should be unique to a user, right? So having something like serial helps me with that. Okay, but enough of that. I won't do it here, but you can implement that in your projects, and this might help you if such a constraint is needed on your database. All right, let's get back to this. So let's say when I do add user, I just want to add this to the database. Okay, so probably the best way to do that, I'm just going to comment this out for now. Probably the best way to do this is to kind of associate a query. So I have an add user, we'll call it add user query. And this is typically how I would do things. I would write out the query. I would make sure that it's correct before I send it into the database, right? So let's say I add user by doing, oh, sorry, not select, but maybe insert into user values. And then maybe user would be, I would specify the user as the fname attribute and also the age attribute. Notice I've left out the UID attribute, because the UID attribute, if it was serial, then we would be able to allow it to kind of increment itself, right? So I don't have to worry about the UID. So the values I would give it is, I'm going to have the uname, right? Uname is coming from the form, comma, and then the age. And the age would just be put in here, right? So presumably I would have insert into user fname, and then values, uname and age. All right, so we would have something like this. And I'm not going to do this, although you can leave this in your demo. But for now, I actually don't want to touch the database. I actually want to just show you the end result. Okay, so although this is good, this is probably something I should keep as a comment. I'm actually going to just put a ... there just to say that in general, I'm going to need a query. Right? I'm going to need a query to pass into our Postgres. Okay, then the command for doing that is pool.query. And then I'm going to do the add user query, which in return is going to give me a callback function containing an error and also the results. Okay, now I'm going to leave out some details here, right? So because I don't have a query, obviously there are going to be some errors associated with it, right? So realistically, the way that we would write this is something like this. If error, then I'm going to respond .end with an error, okay? But here, I don't really want to, like, I know there's going to be an error because I haven't written this yet. But even if I use something like this, I want to kind of simulate the results. Okay, so right now, notice that I'm just simulating the results. I'm not writing in the actual functionality. That's for you to figure out, what you want to do with that functionality. All right, so I'm going to make a users array. Let's just call it US. Okay, so users array, I'm going to make that empty. And then this is my object. So whatever I'm calling here, right? So let's say I'm inserting this value. And let's say when this is successful, I want to pass back the results of this object. Okay, so I want to have an object that looks like this with our name, which is our uname. And I want also the age attribute to be age. Okay. All right. So so actually, let me change this a little bit. This object is really up to us how we want to how we want to set this up, right? So just so that we don't have conflicting names here, so that you can see this later on, I'm just going to call this n and call this a. Okay, so that we have the n attribute and we have the a attribute. All right, so I'm going to do a user and then push this object in there. All right, so I know this is not this is not the real query that we're sending in, right? We're just simulating some result. Okay, so we're simulating a result that we get back from the database. Okay, so really what this is going to look like is this is going to look like this, and then with n colon whatever the person's name is, and then we also have the age colon, and then whatever the person's age is. That's what this array is going to look like. All right, so now let's review what we've done. In our app.post, if I send it to the add user route, there's going to be this body uname and there's going to be body age, and it's going to take those two values and it's going to put it into these variables. Presumably, we would send it to the database as in the form of a query to the database, but here we're just, I'm just making up some result, okay? But in reality, when we send this to the database, we're going to get some results, okay? Now, how do we test this result? So I'm going to then do the response. So response is this res object, our response, JSON. And then I'm going to send the users in the form of a JSON array. All right. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, don't we usually render a file? Don't we usually render an HTML so that the user can see what the result is? And the answer is yes, we do. But I want you to imagine that eventually the call to the database is going to be done by another function. Okay, so it's going to be done by, it's going to be the responsibility of another function. And that's the function that we want to paste all of this code into. All right, so I haven't talked about modularization yet, so that's why I haven't put it into a function. But you can imagine that this is what the function does. It calls the database, it comes back with the result, and then we respond with the JSON object, so that now, once we respond, then the route itself can redirect that data, right, that user's data, into a rendered form, like into the rendered format, so it can then send the US, right, probably whatever is returned here, send it to the views corresponding to whatever view we want for add user. Okay, so I hope that all makes sense. In fact, let me say that one more time. Eventually, and we're going to really get into this later on when we talk about architecture and so on, and just the way that we can modularize programs. So what this does is it sends it over to a file which is primarily responsible for interacting with the database. Okay, so let's say we have a bunch of functions that's primarily used for interacting with database. And let's say one of those functions is called add new user. Okay, so let's say we have a function called add new user here. And this add new user takes in, let's say a uname and an age, right? And its responsibility is to just interact with the database and add that new user. Now, at the same time, if it's if it's successful, then it's going to pass back that new user object, right, back to the caller of that function, right? And if we're at a route that's calling that function, we would then take that new user object, and then we would call the render. We would say, take this object and render it. So perhaps as a feedback to the to the browser or to the client who's calling this function, then we can say new user blah, 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 blah has been added, has been successfully added, right? So that would be the workflow of the interaction. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So right now, let's just imagine this is the functionality that we write. Okay, so how do we test this? Well, there's a couple of things that we need to do in order to test this functionality. So first, I'm going to add a new object called cores. Okay, so cores require cores. All right, so cores stands for cross origin resource sharing. And this basically allows other applications to be able to call these routes, like add user. Okay, so in addition to this, I would have to do the app.use and then cores. I have to call this function called cores. Basically anything under the root. Okay, so I'm going to call the cores function. Okay, so now any application or any application or any subsystem will be able to call the routes that are inside this file. And the last thing I'm going to do is do a module.exports. This I actually added ahead of time. I have to do a module.exports and then equals the app. So whatever I've added, whatever functionality I've added to the app, I want to export that so that I can use it in other instances as well. Okay, so this is our server. Just for 1 second, I just want to make sure that this server, I haven't made any mistakes and this server actually runs properly. So I'm going to come back to our command prompt, and I'm in this root application. I'm just going to do a node and then index.js just to make sure that, yes, it is running on port 5000 here. So everything is good. So now I want to write some tests for it. Okay, I want to write some tests specifically for the code that we've just written for add user. Okay, so now notice what add user does. When I send a post request to add user, right, it does this console.log fine, but then it has this variable that it's taking from the body, okay, of the request. So I have to make sure that the body of the request has a variable called uname, and also in the body there's a variable called age. I have to make sure of these things. Then what this thing does is, well, supposedly calls a database and comes back with some results. In our case, this is going to give me some error, right? But I'm going to then go into our main folder here and write a folder, create a folder called test. Now, it's important that we call it test exactly in this way, okay? Now, in here, we can call the file whatever we want. So server test, maybe, .js, okay? Server test.js. All right, so in a second, I'm going to show you this framework called Mocha, which uses some test assertions in a package called chai. So typically, there's a Mocha chai framework that we would use in order to do our testing. Now, let me just say that it's not the only one out there, but I find that for me, this is the easiest one to use. Okay, and this is probably the one that's most common, the one that most people use to test Node.js applications. Okay, so essentially it gives you a whole set of assertions that you can place on your servers. And let me show you what I mean by this. Now, getting back to the reason why I have to make a folder called test is when I run Mocha later on, Mocha is specifically going to look for a folder called test. And inside, that's where I can put all my test folder, test logic. Okay, so it's going to look specifically inside the folder for a folder called server test. All right, so let's write the server test. So so in a second, what I'll need to do is do a var chai. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. I'm in fact going to go back and do it right now before we even move on. Before I wrote node index.js. Now, if you're following along, you may have gotten an error for this. If you did node index.js, the error would have been that you haven't added cores to your application. So before we do that, we needed to do npm install cores. Okay, so I've already done that ahead of time, so that's why I didn't get an error. But you actually need to do this ahead of time, so I apologize for not doing that. So at the same time, let me do all the packages that I need to install for the testing purposes. So I'm going to do an npm install, and then I need to install chai. That's one thing. Okay, in fact, I need to install 3 packages here just for testing purposes. I need to do an npm install chai-http. Okay, so this is going to allow me to make assertions via HTTP calls. Okay, so I'm gonna install that as well. And then the third one is I'm gonna install Mocha. Now, I have ahead of time installed Mocha globally. So I have done the install, npm install -g Mocha. I have done this already, okay? So I might as well do it again. But this is, it's a good, it's probably good to install Mocha globally just because you don't want to install this over and over again for every project that you have. Okay, all right, so if everything installs correctly, then you should be able to run your application. Okay, so if we do something like node and then index.js, it's still running properly on port 5000. Okay, now back to this. I'm going to now import or require these objects that I've just installed as dependencies. So require chai. I'm going to have a chai HTTP object, and this is a require chai HTTP. And I'm going to also have a var server. Now, please be clear on what this is requesting, okay, so, or requiring. We require from this current directory, I'm going to go up a directory. So right now I have server test.js. I'm going to go up one directory, and my server is located in index.js. So I'm going to go up one directory, and I'm going to go into the index file to look for the server. Now remember, before I've actually exported this already for the use of other programs or other files. So what this is going to import that server into this system, into when we do a test. All right. So I'm going to also do a var should. Now this is this may sound kind of weird, but in chai there is a should function, which basically you can look at as a bunch of assertions, right? So it's a bunch of assertions that we're making. All right, so I think we have everything that we need. We also need a command that says chai.use and then the chai HTTP. Okay, so I'm going to use this chai HTTP object to make HTTP calls. Okay, so this is the object I'm going to use if I ever need to make a HTTP call or HTTP request that's out there. All right, so in Mocha, we use the keyword called describe. Okay, so describe basically says that I have a bunch of test suites or a set of tests that I want to run for a specific purpose. So I'm going to describe the set of tests called users. Okay, so these are all the tests I'm going to write associated with users. Now I'm going to have a function, and this function is going to have all of the tests that are inside, okay? So in here are basically all of the tests associated with user. All right. So, all right. So every test that I'm going to write is going to start with the word it. So it's just notation. It's just, I guess, a standard that we try to make our tests as descriptive as possible. So let's start with our first one. It should add a single user on post request for user, add user, I think we called it, right? So add user. All right, so it should add a single user on the post request add user. All right, so so notice that here we have add user as a post request, so post request for add user, and then I'm going to run through all of this code. So theoretically, what I expect when I make the call to add user is I expect a JSON object corresponding to this user that I've created and that I'm going to send back as a response. Okay, so on the server, I want to simulate that. So, so I'm going to have a callback function, and callback function is going to have another function called done as another callback. So you can imagine that this is a callback within a callback. So, so what do I want to do within this test? So what logic do I have to invoke to convince myself that this story or this task has been done correctly? So the first thing I'm going to do is make a request over to the server. So the way to do that is we do chai.request. Okay, so hopefully this is self-explanatory. In this chai suite, I'm going to send a request to the server. Okay, so I'm going to send a request to the server, and it's going to be in the form of a post request. So send the request to the server .post, and then we have to send in the what do we call this? The route as well. So the route add user. Okay, so you notice all of these dots are kind of chained onto each other, right? So I'm going to request to the server a post command called add user, and then I'm going to send the request. So the send request is basically the point in time where we make the request. All right, so this is also going to include what I need to send as the body. So I want to send along with the body the uname attribute, and here is where I can just make up the test data. Okay, so I'm going to send the uname, I don't know, tester mctesty, I don't know, just make up some name. Okay, and then I'm also going to have an age, which is I'm going to send in the number 23. Okay, so I'm simulating me hitting that form, the form submit button, and sending this object along to the add user, right? All right, so so when I send this along, I'm going to do a .end. So I'm going to end the request, and with the .end, there's going to be a callback function that has an error and a response. Okay, so there's going to be an error object and there's going to be a response object. So what we have to test at this point is this response object. Okay, so if there's an error, obviously all of these things that we're going to test for are going to be false. And I'm actually going to show you that in 1 second. All right, so our response dot should dot have dot status 200. All right, so what this tells me is, or what I'm testing for here is I'm asserting that this response should have the status 200. This is, very, it kind of reads as English, right? Which is the purpose of chai. By the way, have a look at all of the chai reference as well as the chai HTTP reference, just to have an idea of all the assertions that you can make and what types of tests that you can do on your server. There's actually a lot. I'm just showing you one very specific example on this demo here. Our response should be JSON. Okay. So should be type JSON. Okay, so that's what we're testing for here. Now, is this necessary? Well, depending on the functionality that you write, you might say, oh, this is not a test that's functionary, but that's necessary. But you might want to add some other stuff as well. All right. In particular, if it's an array or if it's JSON, I want to test that this also should be a. I think this is the command. Should be a array. Okay, so it should be an array type, which I've set it to be an array type. If you remember our response object in the index.js file. All right, let's keep going. Our response body. Now, what are we responding? We're responding with a JSON object that is an array, but really there's only one object in this array that has the name, uname, and then the age A, right? So I'm going to test that the response body that I'm getting back, the very first element, the first index, the name N should equal, and it should equal, what do we call this guy? Tester, mech testy. Okay, so it should be equal to that. Now, similarly, I should also test that the response for A, you see the object A, should equal 23, because I'm basically sending back that object. Now, I'm imagining that I'm sending this over to the server, and the server has called the database and is successful, right? So I'm imagining that this is inside of a if statement. So if there are no errors, then I'm going to send back that response, right? So this is what I'm specifically testing for. Okay, so maybe I should be a little bit more descriptive with my test. It should add a single user on the post request on a successful post request. Now I can write another test for an unsuccessful post request, right? So I can test for like if it sends back an error, right? Or sends back an error object of some kind. I can test specifically for an error object if there's an error that happens. Okay, so you can see all the different possibilities that we can have for a test. All right, the last thing here is I'm going to invoke the done function. So this means that I'm done with this test. I should go on to the next test. Now, if you take a look at where I started, it started here. So in effect, when you have all of the tests associated with the users, I'm going to have many its, right? Many it tests. So, so I'm going to fill in maybe one more later on, but let's just show you what this looks like. So if I haven't made any mistakes, basically what this should do is use the server located in the index file, send this request, and make sure all of these things are passing. Okay, so let's go over to our command line. And so notice here that one of the folders is called test, right? So not test.js, this is actually a file that was that's in the default application. That's another test suite. But specifically, we're testing the functions that are in test using Mocha, a test folder using Mocha. So the command to do that is simply invoke Mocha on the root of our application. And Mocha is going to give me an error, unexpected token end. All right, so let's see what happened here. Oh, whoops, I had a semicolon there. All right, so I wasn't done with this command, so dot end and then function. All right, let's see if I made any other silly mistakes. All right, let's try that again. Gonna run Mocha. And now it's going to run all of those commands, and it's going to, okay, expected object. Okay, so let's see what is happening here. Should add a single user, and right now we have an error. Let's see what's wrong here. Okay, so let's check our code. It's probably good that this happened. I'm creating this new object, so I'm calling this query. I have the results. This comes into our, yeah, everything seems correct here. Let me just make one last check here. And that seems to be right. Okay, and I'm sending the request to add user. I'm sending the request to add user, and I'm sending the uname and age. Yes, that seems correct. And then I have a response. Our response should have status. Okay, so it seems like this thing is not giving me back the JSON object. Can't imagine why. So I have that and that, the object. Okay, let's run this one more time just to make sure that it's giving me the same error. All right, if I run Mocha, okay. So I'm getting this error again. So what I'll do is do a little bit of debugging here. And this is probably good that we're going through this. So I'm pretty sure my tests are correct. I'm going to try to run this, this application again. So I'll try to do node index.js. It is listening on port 5000. So I'm going to go over to my Chrome. And just to make sure that we are, we have the right route here. So we go to, I believe it was my form. So this gives me uname, age, and submit, and we're going to the add user button. All right, so if we fill in something there, I just want to make sure that we are getting something as a response. Okay, so we're going to go to localhost 5000 / and then my form.html. All right, so if I add something like this and 23 and then press the server button, because that is the submit button. Okay, so I am getting this as a response, so not sure why our test is not working. All right, so I've created this user uname, tester McTesty, and then sending this as our test. Age 23, function end, should have status 200. everything seems correct. So let's try one more time. This is very strange. All right, so I'm going to try the Mocha test one more time. All right, let me pause the recording here and let's try to find out what's going on. All right, so I think I may have found a mistake. So let's try this. So response body should be an array because the error that it was showing me was on the 15th line. All right, so 15th line is this. So I think I'm just missing body here. That's that it was saying that that object does not exist. So let's try it now and see if this works. So by the way, don't worry. I mean, the reason why I made this mistake is because I wasn't looking at the reference, but all of these tests are in the reference. So you can have a look at those and make sure that you're typing them in correctly. I hope this will solve it. So let's do the Mocha again. And now you can see that all the tests are passing. So notice that for each of these tests, I do have multiple assertions that I'm making here. So everything is passing. So we have one test that's passing currently. Now you can imagine that in the end, you're going to have many, many tests, right? And you can split all of these up into different tests as well. You can be very specific in what you're testing for. It's just in this case, I'm just writing everything in here. Okay, now, just one more note about the so notice the error that I was getting here was just because my logic was wrong. Okay, so I wrote the logic wrong. That's my fault. But if your tests are written correctly, the theory is that when we do test first development, this should have been done at the very beginning. So index.js add user theoretically would have no logic. So let's pretend that I haven't even started writing this yet. Okay, so I haven't written any of this code yet. So the first step in all of this should be that I run the test, right? So sorry, I go over to the test and I run it. So I run the run Mocha, and I run the users, and right now I have one failing test, right? So the failing test here is not because I've not written the test correctly. It's that it's because it's not there. That functionality is actually not there. So this test is failing. So then the goal is to go back and to produce the code, right, in kind of a minimal number of steps. So after that, then we go back and do the test again. And see our test passing. Okay, so that's basically the main idea of how we should do testing, or that's how test first development would work. Now, of course, as I did here, I did write the functionality, then I went back to write the test. So in your projects, I really don't mind which way you go. Do try test first. You know, when you're a little bit more familiar with testing, it does take a little bit more understanding of what the eventual feature is going to look like, but that's, you know, a little bit of how we do testing in Node.js. Now I'm just going to maybe give you the skeleton of one more test. So let's say I also, in addition, want to test that the user has been added successfully into the database. Okay, so it should increase the number of users by 1 on a successful post request for add user. All right, so let's say that I want to test for this functionality. All right, and again, we have a done function here. And then I basically make the same request, right? So I can copy all of this, but what I'm testing for is different. All right, so I'm gonna make a request over to, actually, before we do this, I could imagine that I have another functionality, I have another route that I can call, which basically gives me an array of all users. Now, I haven't implemented that here, but let's imagine that we have a route called, let's see, number of users or all users, something along those lines. Okay, so we can do something like chai dot request and then server post, or actually it probably is going to be a get route. So so let's say the route is all users. Okay, so the purpose, let's say that the purpose of this functionality is to be able to get all the users. So let's say we have an array of all the users. Now, again, I haven't put that functionality in index.js, but let's imagine for 1 second that I would write out this function. Okay. So the purpose of this is to originally get an array of users. I should probably end the request there. Okay, and then I have a function, and I have an error and a response. Okay, so I'm going to first call the all users route, and then presumably what I'm going to get as a result is an array of users. Let's just imagine that that's what's happening. All right, so I'm going to make a var and then num users, say num users 0. Okay, so just to indicate that this is called before we do the add user. Okay, so this is the number of users, and I'm going to get the response.body.length. Okay, so again, the assumption is that calling the all users route is going to gives an array of all users. Okay, so it's going to give me like an array corresponding to all the users. All right, so I'm going to take the number of the users at the very beginning. Okay, then let me copy all of this over. So I'm going to make the request. So this is kind of like within the callback, right? So I'm going to first make the request to all users. Then I'm going to send the server post request to add user, this new person, tester McTesty. All right, so so then what I'm going to look for, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the num users again, and I'm going to see what the length of the of the of the users are. Okay, so in here I'm going to call this function again. So you see, I'm gonna get all the users, I get the array, and here I'm going to have the var num users 1 is equal to response.body.length. And I'm going to finally assert here in the end that num users 1 minus num users 0. Right, so this number should equal. All right, so I'm going to add one. I'm going to have one extra user on the post request for add user. Okay, so let's go through the logic again. So so first I call add user all users. Notice that this is not there yet, so we actually have to add the functionality in there. So then we take a look at what the response is. The response body length is going to give me the current users at this point. Then I invoke add user, then I check the length of the response body again, and then make sure that the num users 1 minus num user 0 is equal to 1. You could probably think of other ways that we can test for this functionality, but I just wanted to do this as kind of a stupid example to show you how we can be sort of creative with our tests. Okay. So as I said before, you should probably at the end of every iteration have a bunch of tests associated with the stories that you're writing. Okay. Towards the end of the iterations, I'll look a little bit more heavily on the tests that you write and how specifically are you writing the test, and are they actually testing for the stories that you're proposing for that iteration. Okay. All right. So hopefully that helps. I'm gonna stop the demo here. And in our next demo, which is probably going to be in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about how we modularize all of our code. All right, thank you for watching.